The air at the 29 Palms Combat Center was not merely hot, it was a physical weight, a solid thing made of shimmering heat, fine ground dust, and the incessant oppressive glare of a sun that held no mercy. It was an atmosphere designed to bake arrogance into brittle ceramics and boil impatience out of a man's soul. For Gunnery Sergeant Cade, however, this furnace was his kingdom. The heat was his ally, the dust his mantle. He stood in the center of the mess hall, a structure of prefabricated steel that groaned under the solar assault, and his voice was a part of the oppressive environment itself. It was a loud, gravelly instrument, accustomed to being obeyed, an auditory hammer used to shape the soft metal of new recruits into something resembling United States Marines. Cade was a man built like a cask, barrel-chested and thick-necked, with a face that seemed permanently flushed from either the sun or a surplus of self-regard. He held a metal tray, but it was a prop, a scepter. His true performance was for the dozen young Marines seated around him, their faces a mixture of fear, admiration, and the desperate eagerness to please that is the hallmark of the unproven. They were his chorus, his congregation, and he was their preacher of hardship and strength. He moved through the world as if it were a stage built for him, and every interaction was a scene in which he was the undisputed lead. "You see that heat out there?" Cade boomed, gesturing with his fork toward the blinding white square of the doorway. The Marines nodded in unison, a field of freshly shorn heads bowing to his wisdom. "That ain't just weather. That's a filter. It finds the weak, the soft, the ones who whined for their mamas when the world got a little too real. It cooks them until all that's left is a little puddle of regret." He laughed, a harsh, barking sound that echoed off the metal walls. His echo, a corporal named Jensen with weasel-like features and an even more eager-to-please demeanor, laughed a fraction of a second later, just loud enough to be noticed. It was a practiced sycophantic harmony. In Cade's mind, the universe was a simple, brutalist structure. It was a pyramid of strength, and he resided comfortably near the top of his visible world. Strength was loud, it was big, it was confident, it was the certainty in his own voice, the solid mass of his own body, the unquestioning obedience he commanded from those beneath him. Weakness was the opposite. It was quiet. It was small. It was hesitant. It was anything that did not immediately and loudly assert its own presence. This was the gospel of Gunnery Sergeant Cade, a philosophy forged in the uncomplicated fires of physical dominance and hammered into shape by years of institutional hierarchy. It was a worldview as solid and unyielding as the desert floor, and just as devoid of nuance. He saw the world in high contrast black and white, a landscape of predators and prey, of hammers and nails, and he, unequivocally, was a hammer. His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his court, ensuring all were paying the required tribute of their attention. He drank in their fear and respect like water, a necessary hydration for his ego, which was a vast and thirsty thing. The mess hall was his domain, a place of brief respite for others, but for him, another theater for the endless performance of his own authority. Every gesture was amplified, every word a proclamation. He was not merely a gunnery sergeant, he was the living embodiment of the institution, the gatekeeper of its violent masculine mysteries. He believed this with a certainty so profound, it was indistinguishable from fact, a concrete edifice built on a foundation of unexamined assumptions. It was a magnificent structure, this ego of his, but it had been built without windows, allowing no light from the outside world to penetrate its self-assured darkness. It was into this carefully controlled environment of noise and deference that the anomaly first registered. It was not a sound or a movement, but the opposite, a profound and unsettling lack of both. In the far corner of the mess hall, away from the main tables, a figure sat alone. It was a small island of stillness in Cade's turbulent sea of restless energy. The person wore a gray hoodless sweatshirt, the fabric worn soft and thin, and a pair of faded desert camouflage trousers tucked into scuffed anonymous boots. There was no rank, no insignia, nothing to denote a place in the rigid hierarchy that gave Cade's life meaning. The figure was bent over a complex piece of equipment on the table, a tactical data link interface that was notoriously finicky, its casing open to reveal a bewildering nest of wires and circuit boards. Cade's eyes narrowed. The person was a woman. Her frame was slight, almost lost in the drab clothing. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, severe bun, and her focus was entirely on her task. She was using a pair of delicate calipers to adjust something microscopic on a processor chip, her movements economical and precise, utterly absorbed. She did not seem to be aware of the heat, the noise, or the gravitational pull of Cade's personality that held the rest of the room in orbit. She was a pocket of silence, a void in his universe. And to Gunnery Sergeant Cade, a void was an intolerable vacuum that demanded to be filled with the sound of his own voice. He watched her for a full minute, his mind processing the image through its crude binary filter. Small, quiet, female, unadorned. His brain cross-referenced these inputs against his internal catalog of the world and produced a single dismissive output. Weak. Insignificant. A technician, a civilian contractor, a glorified librarian who had somehow wandered into his armory. Her intense focus was not a sign of discipline to him. It was a sign of timid introversion. Her stillness was not calm. It was fear. Her silence was not concentration. It was a failure to properly acknowledge his presence, a subtle but infuriating act of disrespect. A slow, ugly smile spread across Cade's face. Here was an opportunity. A live fire demonstration for his young recruits on the proper maintenance of the natural order. He would make an example of this quiet little mouse. He would show his boys how a real Marine handled those who did not understand their place. He pushed his tray away with a loud scrape of metal on metal, the sound a declaration of intent. The chorus fell silent, their eyes flicking from Cade to the woman in the corner and back again. They could smell the blood in the water. The performance was about to begin. "Well, well," Cade announced to the room, his voice dripping with condescending theatricality. "What do we have over here?" He began his approach, a predator closing in. He walked with a swagger, his boots thudding heavily on the concrete floor, each step a deliberate beat in the rhythm of his dominance. Corporal Jensen scrambled to his feet and followed a pace behind, the loyal jackal in the lion's shadow. The air in the mess hall grew thick with anticipation. The recruits leaned forward, their cheap entertainment about to be served. Cade loomed over the small table, casting the woman and her delicate work into his considerable shadow. "Lost, little bird?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking purr. The woman did not look up. Her hands remained perfectly steady as she made one final infinitesimal adjustment with the calipers. A tiny green light on the circuit board flickered and then held steady. She placed the tool down on a clean cloth with surgical precision. Only then did she lift her head, her eyes meeting his. They were a pale, dispassionate gray, like stones at the bottom of a cold river. There was no fear in them, no surprise. There was nothing at all but a calm, analytical neutrality that was more unnerving than any defiance. "No, Gunnery Sergeant," she said. Her voice was quiet, low, and perfectly flat. It was not a sound meant to carry. It was a simple transmission of data. The lack of any emotional reaction was a splash of cold water on Cade's fiery ego. He had expected a flinch, a stammer, a nervous glance. He had received none of it. This was not according to the script. He felt a flicker of irritation. He needed to escalate, to force the reaction the scene demanded. "This is a restricted area for support staff," he lied, gesturing vaguely at the mess hall. "And that," he pointed a thick finger at the complex device, "is a sensitive piece of gear, not a toy for the IT department to play with." "The system was throwing a sync error on the uplink," she stated, again in that unnervingly placid monotone. "It needed recalibration." "It needed what?" Cade barked, feigning outrage. He turned to Jensen and winked. "Listen to this, Corporal. We got ourselves a real tech genius here. What's your name, sweetheart?" The woman's gaze did not waver. "That's not relevant." Cade's smile tightened. The word sweetheart had been a deliberate barb, designed to belittle and provoke. It had slid off her as if she were coated in oil. The recruits were watching, and his performance was beginning to falter. The quiet little mouse was refusing to squeak. He felt the foundations of his authority tremble almost imperceptibly. He needed more force. He needed to reassert the physics of his world. He reached out and placed a heavy, proprietary hand on her shoulder. It was a gesture of casual ownership, of physical intimidation disguised as a friendly touch. It was a move he had used 1,000 times to remind subordinates of their place in the food chain. "Everything is relevant when I say it is, librarian," he growled, his voice losing its playful edge and taking on a harder, more threatening tone. "Now, I suggest you pack up your little science fair project and get back to whichever cubicle you crawled out of before you break something important. Leave the real work to the professionals." She looked down at the hand on her shoulder. She did not try to shrug it off. She simply looked at it, her gray eyes cataloging it as an object, a piece of data. Then she looked back up at him. For the first time, there was a flicker of something in her expression, but it was not fear. It was a faint clinical curiosity, the look of a biologist examining a particularly loud and aggressive insect. "Your hand is applying uneven pressure to my clavicle," she said, her voice still utterly devoid of emotion. "It is counterproductive." A few of the recruits snickered nervously. The word counterproductive was so jarringly technical, so out of place in this primal confrontation that it bordered on the absurd. Cade's face went from flush to a deep mottled crimson. He had been publicly analyzed and dismissed. The hammer had struck, and the nail had commented on its technique. This was an intolerable breach of protocol. He snatched his hand back as if burned. The edifice of his ego, that great windowless fortress, now had a hairline crack in its facade. Rage, pure and hot, flooded the void left by his confusion. "You think you're smart?" he spat, his voice rising in volume to compensate for his loss of control. "You think because you can play with wires you know something about the real world? About what we do here?" He jabbed a finger toward a nearby training simulator, a state-of-the-art marksmanship range set up in a cordoned-off section of the hall. "That's our world. That's about skill, about pressure, something a paper pusher like you wouldn't understand." He was flailing, his insults becoming cruder, more desperate. He was no longer performing for the recruits. He was trying to convince himself. The woman's gaze followed his finger to the simulator. It was the XM-7 Advanced Combat Simulation Unit, a notoriously difficult system that replicated the ballistic properties and environmental factors of a real-world engagement with brutal fidelity. It was used to separate the competent from the truly gifted. Cade saw her look and misinterpreted it. He saw weakness, an opening. He pressed his advantage, his voice swelling with renewed confidence. "Tell you what," he boomed, a showman once more. "You look like you've never held anything heavier than a keyboard. I'm going to give you a chance to see how the other half lives, you and me, right now. We'll run the hostage-down protocol, most complex scenario in the system. Even my best guys struggle with it." He grinned, a predator's baring of teeth. "You probably won't even figure out how to take the safety off. But it'll be educational for you. And," he added, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the entire silent room, "it'll be damned entertaining for us." The challenge hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It was a public gauntlet, thrown down not to test her skill, but to ritualistically confirm her incompetence. It was a trap designed for her complete and utter humiliation. The recruits buzzed with excitement. Jensen was practically vibrating with vicarious pleasure. The woman was silent for a long moment. She looked from the simulator back to Cade's snarling face. He saw a hesitation, the fear he had been trying to elicit all along. He was winning. The world was righting itself. Then, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Okay," she said. The word was so small, so quiet, it was almost swallowed by the cavernous room, but it landed with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. It was not the word of someone accepting a challenge. It was the word of someone granting a request. The distinction was subtle, but it was there, a strange and unsettling dissonance in the tone of the confrontation. Cade, however, was too high on his own impending victory to notice. He just heard the assent he wanted. The mouse had agreed to walk into the trap. "Excellent," he roared, clapping his hands together. "Corporal, get the lady a rifle." He turned to his audience. "All right, boys, lesson time. Pay attention. You're about to see the difference between the talkers and the doers." The woman stood. Her movements were fluid and economical, with no wasted energy. She walked toward the simulator bay, her posture straight, her steps even. As she passed the row of recruits, they instinctively shrank back, making way for her as if an invisible field of pressure preceded her. Cade, strutting behind her, mistook their reaction as deference to him. He was the master of ceremonies in this public execution. Jensen handed her a simulation rifle, a heavily modified M4 carbine weighted and balanced to perfectly replicate the real thing. He offered it to her with a condescending smirk, holding it out like a bone to a dog. She took it without a word. Her hands closed around the weapon, and for the first time, a change occurred. It was not a change in her expression, which remained a mask of placid neutrality. It was a change in the way she existed in space. The rifle did not seem like a foreign object in her hands. It seemed like an extension of them, a part of her that had been temporarily missing and was now restored. Her fingers found the controls not by searching, but by instinct. It was a subtle shift, a realignment of gravity around her, but it was there. Cade, however, was blind to it. He saw only the small woman and the large rifle. He saw the comedy, not the competence. He stepped up to the instructor's console and keyed in the scenario. "All right, librarian. Scenario 734, Ambush Alley. Multiple hostiles, multiple hostages, non-combatants in the crossfire. You have 90 seconds from the first shot to neutralize all threats. Fail to identify a threat, you lose. Hit a civilian, you lose. Hit a hostage, you lose. Take too long, you lose. Simple, right?" He chuckled. The program was a nightmare. A chaotic storm of pop-up targets and split-second shoot/no-shoot decisions that required a preternatural level of cognitive processing and muscle memory. The base record, held by a visiting MARSOC operator, was 84 seconds with a 90% threat neutralization. The woman said nothing. She raised the rifle to her shoulder. The motion was not the jerky, uncertain lift of a novice. It was a single, smooth, unbroken arc of motion, like a piston seating itself in a perfectly machined cylinder. The stock of the rifle met her shoulder and settled there as if it had been custom molded for her. She did not brace, she did not tense. She simply became one with the machine in her hands, her body a stable, organic firing platform. "Simulator is hot," Cade announced, his voice booming with smug finality. "Engage when ready." The large screen in front of her flickered to life, displaying a hyper-realistic alleyway in a crowded urban market. Civilians wandered through the frame, digital ghosts programmed to obstruct and confuse. The woman's eyes were fixed on the screen, but they were not scanning. They were simply open, absorbing the totality of the visual data at once. She breathed out, a slow, controlled exhalation, and then she moved. It was not a move Cade or any of his recruits had ever seen before. The first target, a hostile figure emerging from a doorway, appeared on the far left of the screen. Before the simulator could even register the target with its customary audio cue, there was a sharp, distinct crack. A red circle appeared on the digital figure's head. Instantaneous. Impossible. Then, two more targets appeared simultaneously on the right and center. Crack, crack, two more red circles. She was not acquiring targets and firing, it was as if she were firing at locations she knew targets were about to be. Her movements were a blur of micro-corrections, her body a symphony of controlled violence. The barrel of the simulation rifle swiveled in short, brutal arcs, spitting out digital death with an eerie, rhythmic precision. The room had fallen into a silence so profound, it felt like a physical pressure. The only sounds were the sharp cracks of the simulator and the faint whir of its cooling fans. Cade's smug grin had frozen on his face, then slowly melted away, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. This was not the fumbling incompetence he had staged. This was not even the high-level competence of a seasoned operator. This was something else entirely. It was a level of performance that defied the known limits of human reaction time. Hostile, crack, civilian crosses, no shot, hostile peeks from behind hostage, crack. A perfect shot through the sliver of exposed head, a shot so precise it was considered a low-probability anomaly in the system's own analytics. The 90-second clock on the monitor seemed to be moving in slow motion, while the woman in front of it moved at the speed of thought. The chaos on the screen was met with an unnerving absolute calm. She was the eye of a hurricane of her own creation. The final target, the scenario's boss, a heavily armed figure who burst from a car, was neutralized by two shots to the chest and one to the head in the space of a single heartbeat. Crack, crack, crack. Then, silence. The screen flashed the results. Threats neutralized 100%, civilian casualties 0, hostage casualties 0, accuracy 100%. Time elapsed 41.7 seconds. 41.7 seconds, less than half the time of the MARSOC operator's record. It was not just a new record, it was a statistical impossibility. A score so perfect, it suggested a flaw in the machine, not a miracle of the user. Cade stared at the numbers, his mind refusing to process them. His entire world view, that simple, solid pyramid of strength, was crumbling into dust. The hammer had struck the nail, and the nail had turned out to be a diamond, shattering the hammer on impact. The recruits were statues, their faces pale with a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrifying awe. The woman lowered the rifle. The motion was as smooth and deliberate as when she had raised it. The unity between woman and machine was dissolved. She turned, the rifle held loosely in one hand, and looked at Cade. Her expression was unchanged. There was no triumph, no satisfaction, no "I told you so." There was only that same calm, dispassionate neutrality. She had not been proving a point. She had been performing a function. She held the rifle out to him. "The trigger mechanism has a slight lag, about 12 milliseconds. You should have your maintenance crew look at it." Her voice, flat and technical, cut through the stunned silence and landed on Cade like a physical blow. He did not take the rifle. He could not. His hands, which had felt so strong and sure just minutes before, now seemed to be made of lead. His authority, his very identity, had been publicly and completely dismantled in 41.7 seconds by a quiet woman he had called librarian. It was into this tableau of shattered arrogance and silent astonishment that a new sound intruded. It was the rhythmic, percussive thump-thump-thump of heavy helicopter blades, growing rapidly closer. It was a sound of immense and urgent authority. Every head in the room, except for the woman's, snapped toward the entrance. Through the shimmering heat haze, a UH-60 Black Hawk, painted in the subdued markings of a command transport, was descending with aggressive speed onto the tarmac just outside. The helicopter landed not with the gentle settling of a routine flight, but with the purposeful, ground-shaking thud of a rapid insertion. The side doors slid open before the rotors had even begun to slow, and three figures emerged, ducking under the spinning blades. They moved with a shared, unmistakable aura of command. They were generals. One wore the 3 stars of a lieutenant general, the other two the 2 stars of major generals. Their uniforms were crisp, their movements precise, their faces set like granite. They ignored the frantic salutes of the base personnel scrambling to meet them and walked directly toward the mess hall, their strides eating up the ground with an unhurried intensity that was more intimidating than any sprint. The moment they stepped through the doorway, the atmosphere in the room changed again. The stunned silence deepened into a reverential, terrified hush. Cade, jolted from his stupor, felt a primal fear grip him. 3 generals, unannounced, moving with this level of purpose, meant that something of monumental importance was happening. He snapped to attention, his body moving on pure, panicked instinct. "Generals on deck!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with strain. The 3 men ignored him completely. Their eyes swept the room, bypassing the terrified recruits, bypassing the frozen form of Gunnery Sergeant Cade, and settled on the small, quiet woman in the worn sweatshirt. The lieutenant general, a man with a stern, deeply lined face and eyes that had seen continents of conflict, broke from the group and walked directly toward her. He stopped a few feet in front of her, his posture ramrod straight. "Chief," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble that carried the weight of absolute authority. It was not a question. It was a title, a recognition. The woman finally acknowledged them with a slight inclination of her head. "General Masters," she replied, her tone still flat, but with a new, almost imperceptible undertone of professional courtesy. General Masters gestured toward the data link device on her table. "Is it ready?" "The micro-relay was misaligned. I've corrected the drift," she answered. "It's stable." "Good," the general said. He then turned his head slightly, his gaze falling upon Cade for the first time. His eyes were not angry. They were cold. They were the eyes of a man looking at a malfunctioning piece of equipment that was about to be discarded. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said, the title sounding like an accusation. "I am told you were interacting with my chief warrant officer." Cade's blood ran cold. Chief warrant officer. The term sliced through his panic-addled brain. He tried to speak, but only a dry croak emerged. The pyramid of his world had not just crumbled. It had been inverted. He was at the bottom, crushed under a weight he could not even comprehend. General Masters did not wait for an answer. He turned his attention back to the room at large, his voice rising to a clear, commanding tone that brooked no argument. "For the education of those present," he began, his cold gaze sweeping over the pale faces of the recruits, "you have been in the presence of Chief Warrant Officer 5 Alara Vance, call sign Nix." A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the room. The name Nix was not a name. It was a myth, a ghost story told in hushed tones in Spec Ops barracks and intelligence agency cleanrooms. A legend. Nix was the operator who had walked into a besieged embassy in Khartoum alone and walked out with all 17 hostages. Nix was the name attached to the impossible kill shot in the Hindu Kush, a shot that had decapitated a terror network and that physicists still argued was impossible. Nix was the architect of Operation Silent Shadow, a cyber warfare campaign so devastating its full details remained classified at a level above the president. The general continued, his voice like a chisel carving a new reality into the minds of everyone present. Chief Vance holds the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 silver stars, and a list of other commendations so long and so classified that you, Gunnery Sergeant, do not have the security clearance to even read the list of abbreviations. She is not a technician. She is the woman they send in when generals like me have failed. She is the final option, the last resort, the weapon that we pray we never have to use. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. He looked from the woman, this living legend in a worn-out sweatshirt, to the now trembling form of Gunnery Sergeant Cade. She was here, on my direct orders, to personally service a piece of prototype equipment that only she understands because she designed it. Your job was to secure this area and ensure she was not disturbed. Instead, the general's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. You chose to engage in a display of petty, chest-thumping arrogance that has delayed a mission of critical national importance. You chose to harass an operator who has forgotten more about combat than you will ever know. You did not just fail your duty. You have become a liability to the security of this nation. Cade's face was ashen. The world had dissolved into a roaring in his ears. The woman he had called sweetheart and librarian was a figure more powerful and more respected than the 3 generals standing before him combined. His humiliation was so total, so absolute, it was a physical agony. Then came the final devastating blow. General Masters turned to face Chief Vance fully. The other 2 generals stepped forward, flanking him. The 3 men, titans of the modern military, stood before the quiet, unassuming woman. And in perfect, synchronized motion, they raised their hands to their brows. They rendered a slow, formal, and deeply reverential salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture between officers. It was an offering, a tribute from the highest echelons of power to a master of their craft. It was the ultimate public gesture of respect, and in that same moment, the final nail in the coffin of Cade's career. Chief Warrant Officer Vance gave a short, crisp nod in return. It was an acknowledgement, nothing more. Her focus was already elsewhere. "The relay is synced," she said to the general. "I'm mission ready." The general dropped his salute. "Your transport is waiting, Chief." He then gave Cade one last look, a look of pure, unadulterated dismissal. "Sergeant Major will see you in my office at 1400. Pack your things." He did not need to say more. Everyone in the room knew what it meant. Gunnery Sergeant Cade's career was over. His identity, the only one he had ever known, had been publicly executed. The generals turned and escorted Chief Vance out of the mess hall. They did not flank her as guards, but as an honor guard. She walked with them, a small, quiet figure surrounded by immense power, yet she was clearly the center of it, the true source of its gravity. As she left, she did not give Cade or the stunned recruits a single backward glance. The drama, the confrontation, the humiliation, it had all been a minor, irrelevant system error to her, a brief and counterproductive delay that she had corrected before moving on to the real task at hand. She disappeared into the shimmering heat, boarding the Black Hawk, a ghost returning to the shadows. In the ringing silence she left behind, Cade stood alone. The recruits, his former chorus, no longer looked at him. Their eyes were all fixed on the empty doorway through which a legend had just passed. Their understanding of the world had been irrevocably altered. They had seen that true strength was not loud, it was quiet. True confidence did not need to perform. It simply was. They had witnessed the violent, humbling collision of arrogance and competence, and the lesson was one they would carry for the rest of their lives. Cade finally lowered his head, his thick shoulders slumping, a hollowed-out monument to his own spectacular ignorance. The story of what happened in the mess hall that day became a piece of folklore at 29 Palms. It was told and retold, embellished and polished, but the core truth of it remained a potent cautionary tale. It was a story about a loud-mouthed gunny who thought he was a hammer and the quiet woman who turned out to be the anvil of God. The legend of Cade's fall spread like a desert wildfire, a stark reminder that the most dangerous people in the world are often the ones you see least. It served as a vital, institutional corrective, a story told to new lieutenants and cocky sergeants to remind them that rank and volume are poor substitutes for wisdom and respect. Years later, a man named Cade worked as a logistics manager for a private shipping company in Barstow. He was a quiet man, reserved and deferential. He spoke in low tones and listened more than he talked. Sometimes, when a new, arrogant young hire would start throwing their weight around, he would watch them with a sad, knowing look in his eyes, but he would never say a word. He had learned his lesson in a crucible of shame so intense